Today's episode of The Bluff is sponsored by SitRep. SitRep is a notorious open source intelligent app that provides the latest updates for over 180 countries and over 500 topics, allowing you to stay ahead and informed. Now available on Apple and Google. Thank you, SitRep, for sponsoring this episode.
Welcome back to the Bottom Line Up Front, an Artorias podcast. I'm Matt.
And I'm Stefano, the Chief Intelligence Officer of Artorias. And today we are going to do another segment of Global Intel, where we cover multiple topics and conflict zones around the world to give you an understanding of what happened in the last 2 weeks. And for this segment of Global Intel, we are obviously going to start with the situation with the Straits of Hormuz and how President Trump, starting today, as of this recording, April 13th, 2026, has now put into effect a blockade targeting any vessel that is entering or uses Iranian ports. President Trump's announcement of a blockade follows the failure of this weekend's negotiations in Islamabad, Pakistan, led by the U.S. delegation, Vice President J.D. Vance, and from the Iranian side, the Speaker of Parliament, Gharibaf, where both sides entered into a ceasefire after almost 6 weeks of conflict to try to see if they can get to an agreement and a broader peace deal. Although both sides has different claims, it does appear that the main sticking point and breaking point is still related to Iran's nuclear enrichment. Iran, one of the few tools that they've really had to really impact and force the United States to back down or serve as a deterrent, has been their ability to at least close the Straits of Hormuz, not necessarily from a military perspective, because militarily Iran has suffered significant amount of casualties and their navy has been destroyed, but from a psychological perspective. The United States did, at the beginning of this war, give Iran sanction relief in order for them to smuggle and ship their oil outside, specifically to China, which China continues to be the primary buyer of Iranian oil. But now, again, today, April 13th, CENTCOM has officially started a naval blockade preventing any vessel that enters into Iranian ports or uses the quote-unquote Iranian safe passage route where they pay a toll to continue onward outside of the Straits of Hormuz. I think this effort is designed to cause maximum amount of economic pain to Iran with the lowest amount of possible military risk. Obviously, we're not talking about a seizure of the Strait of Karg Island or Keshem Island or other areas related to the Straits of Hormuz. And I think the administration is leveraging this to cause maximum amount of economic pain to the Islamic Republic, and in a way also force China, as they do get a lot of their oil from Iran. And Iran right now, and no other real country in the Middle East, can ship oil out of the Straits of Hormuz. I think the administration is using this to also get China to kind of put more pressure onto Iran. But with that kind of quick summary, Matt, I'd love to get your intake and your input because a lot of people were wondering if President Trump was going to authorize ground operations inside of Iran, but it looks like right now it's just a naval blockade, which is in effect.
Yeah, so I think, and we've talked about this, it wouldn't be popular to have boots on the ground in a sustained and meaningful way. And so this pivot makes sense, I guess, through that lens. And it's a way of applying sort of economic warfare. It's a bit of an escalation as well, militarily, and it's denying that revenue stream, which is something that they had been criticized for when Iran was able to enforce tolls. And one of the first things that I thought of, whether it's right or not wrong, I was thinking of how violent extremist organizations, most of their funding comes through tolls and taxes. So that can be a very effective way. Obviously, Iran is much larger, but the items that they're taxing are much more expensive and they're able to levy a higher tax. I think we have to see how other countries react to this. We know that Britain and France were not in favor of the blockade, and I do worry that we could see alliance strain because of this. So if we continue to see NATO partners refusing participation, it just gives the whole operational burden over to the United States, and it doesn't give them any sort of political cover. So it's going to be interesting to watch how this plays out. Um, but I think that they found the less bad alternative that will be less costly for them domestically. Unfortunately, politically, domestically, there was no good option here because boots on the ground is a bad option. If this doesn't work and we continue to see the price of the pump go up, then it's still going to have a measurable political effect domestically.
I think one of the interesting aspects though was that when the ceasefire was first announced last week, clearly the Iranians, specifically through their state media, but I think also from social media, really pushed a lot of these narratives. Like people were talking about, oh, the United States has agreed Iran can charge a toll. This is kind of like the America Suez Canal movement, kind of referencing the 1956 British and French invasion of the Suez Canal with in support of Israel against Egypt. That the U.S. forced the Brits out, and that kind of was like the end of the British Empire. Like these very wild takes, and I think for a lot of people, like this is where like you can't necessarily take social media at face value because the administration never was going to leverage or allow Iran to kind of do a toll that they have been very clear that there needs to be unobstructed freedom of navigation. There was actually an Associated Press report laid out that both Iran and Oman agreed to set up a system where both countries were going to set up a toll to kind of charge ships that go through the Straits of Hormuz. And the next day, Oman came out forcefully, if I might say, absolutely resoundingly denying this and saying that they will stick with international law and maritime law. And that kind of brings up this very interesting point that I think from the European perspective, although they're not going to get involved in the blockade, one of the areas that they are going to get involved is kind of maybe these demining operations, and similar to what we saw with the Houthis at the Red Sea, with the EU naval mission around the Red Sea for kind of the safe navigations. It does look like that the UK and France are going to lead an international coalition that, at least from the coordination piece, involves up to over 40 countries. They are going to lead an international coalition to at least try to reopen the Straits of Hormuz from a naval presence perspective and a demining operation. We have seen, even though President Trump has been very critical of NATO and their lack of support and role in this, they have said that they are going to kind of get involved in that, but they are not going to participate, the EU or NATO or even our Gulf allies, in the American blockade against Iran. But one of the aspects I think that where the Iranians are in a kind of in a conundrum right now is like, as if Iran is kind of in effect doing a blockade, the United States is just now mirroring it, right? And so that kind of limits the escalation ladder in some aspects for Iran. We do see some of Iran still launch drones, apparently against Bahrain. We have seen some of those, but obviously at a lot lower levels than we've seen in the past. But the United States has already challenged Iran's kind of claim of the closure of the Straits of Hormuz with two destroyers crossing over the Straits of Hormuz over the weekend and announcing that operation. Actually, one of the destroyers did shoot down an Iranian drone who was sent over to monitor the U.S. naval ships. They shot it down. Then CENTCOM was very public about saying, "Hey, we have our destroyers conducting a freedom of navigation operation, similar to maybe what we see the U.S. do in South China Sea or in the Taiwan Strait when China decides to impose kind of these very strict demands that is smacks in the face of international law." But it's very interesting that Iran, at the beginning of the ceasefire announcement, at least publicly, was trying to say that they have maybe at least some levels of support. They're trying to push the Oman narrative that fell apart. But I think Iran in the Straits of Hormuz is feeling completely isolated internationally, and that no country is willing to accept this. I mean, the foreign minister of Singapore in the parliament in Singapore actually went out and kind of said, if Iran can claim this in a body of water that stretches over, the shortest stretch between Iran and Oman and the Straits of Hormuz, 21 kilometers, Singapore is 2 kilometers through the Straits of Malacca, right? And Singapore saying we're never going to claim this. It violates all constructs of international law and the right of freedom of navigation. And I think that's a fundamental issue. And I think Iran might be almost even overplaying their hand because they're analyzing this from the U.S. Israel, completely ignoring the international community's component to this. But more importantly, they're also ignoring, and I think a lot of analysts are ignoring, the agency that the Gulf countries have, specifically Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, and how they will never, ever, in any circumstances, enable their oil to be told by maritime vessels by Iran to get that. I mean, that is just not in the realm of possibility because that it goes against the heart of their economic interest. They would never accept this. And I think one of the interesting aspects is that gets also underreported is the hawkishness specifically of UAE. I mean, UAE has clearly been the most hawkish element in the Gulf states against Iran, both publicly and clearly behind the scenes, both from a military support component to the U.S. and Israel strikes against Iran. There's even been reporting that towards the tail end of the latest, before the ceasefire announced, or actually shortly after the ceasefire was announced, there was reporting that even possibly UAE Air Force conducted strikes inside of Iran against their petrochemical facilities or oil storage facilities, right? And I think that's a very interesting component that we're ignoring this. And Iran, in a way, I mean, we've covered this in previous episodes where we were talking about the Saudi Arabia UAE split. We saw that obviously in Yemen with the Southern Transitional Council, how the UAE overplayed their hands there, and the Saudi Arabia started to conduct airstrikes against the STC and kind of led to, for all intents and purposes, the collapse of the STC and UAE kind of withdrawing from Yemen. We also saw that tension extend itself to Sudan, where the UAE is supporting the rapid support forces and Saudi Arabia is supporting the military dictatorship and kind of the internationally recognized government of Khartoum, right? And we've seen those splits play out. It looks like the Iran attacks across the region has really re-solidified the Gulf Cooperation Council's alliance, right? Maybe Oman is this odd one out. They've always been the odd one out, but there was a lot of suspicion that maybe Oman was much more favorable to Iran, and I think that's been vastly overplayed. But clearly, you have Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait, Bahrain, Jordan, and maybe to a lesser extent Qatar take a little bit more hawkish approach. And I think the loss of Dubai for Iran is going to be significant because Dubai played a key role for Iran for sanction evasion against the United States. But, and Iran has basically burned that bridge to the ground, and they've lost all their regional trading partners with one stroke, making them much more dependent on China, which was already, for all intents and purposes, extorting Iran and taking advantage of Iran's a weak positioning. Now they're just going to be much more beholden, and we see kind of China follow a similar economic model with what they've done with the Russians and taking advantage of this. We're probably going to see it with the Chinese, and I think that's why we're seeing this blockade. But I think regionally, it's clear to anybody that at least we're seeing a coalescing of the GCC country and a much more hawkish approach against Iran. What would be interesting is from the European component, do the Europeans, it looks like the narrative they're doing from the Straits of Hormuz and the reopening of the Straits of Hormuz are going to tie it more to supporting the GCC countries rather than the U.S. blockade on Iranian vessels.
So I would ask you this. I think that it's likely that the GCC sees an upside to the pressure that the United States is applying and how they're applying it to the situation in the Strait. My question to you would be, how do you think this affects their tolerance for pain, their threshold when it comes to attacks directed at them based on their need for freedom of navigation to move their products through the Strait?
I mean, I think broadly speaking, the question that's going to be answered shortly, Matt, just to kind of in a broad sense. I mean, the question we is going to be is who can tolerate more pain, right? Is it Iran can tolerate more pain? It can the American people tolerate more pain? Obviously, because we have more domestic considerations. Can the GCC tolerate more economic pain? That's the game now that we have. It's kind of this military brinkmanship short of so far kinetic military action and seeing if this can then go into the negotiation table. What I would say though, if you're Iran, I think we focus so much on the United States. We focus on the economic damage on the GCC countries. What we have completely ignored in many aspects is not being talked about is the Iranian economy. I mean, before this war, the Iranian economy was in a downward spiral. Their currency is worthless. And now you add to that a devastating war that has knocked out large segments of their petrochemical facilities, large segments of their manufacturing base, both either tied to the private sector or more importantly tied to the government sector as well. That is now going to cause high levels of unemployment and the economic damage that these strikes have happened across Iran, again, from a military civilian infrastructure perspective. And the fact that Iran continues to have an internet blackout, really hardly any exports, even with the sanction relief with some of the oils and some of the vessels that go through the tolls, have people are saying, oh, they're making more money now than they have. That's a ridiculous assumption to make. An absolute ludicrous assumption to make. It's the only thing that they were able to generate in this time frame, and it's nowhere near enough from an economic perspective for Iran to function as an economy. And we
Well, and
know that.
it's also where that money is going.
Correct. And I actually the question though has also become from the Iranian economy perspective, right? The oil can get out. The question is the payments. And a lot of those payments are not easily accessible to Iran even to this moment. Right. And so I think people are looking what they basically said is they looked at the sanction relief that the US did to calm the markets, which again is important to note that the price of oil, obviously there was a huge supply shock. Nobody's disputing that. But from a commodities perspective, the price of oil now never got to the level of people it got after Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, right? 2022 did not get to that level. Like it was the price of oil was worse there, even though you can make an argument that the oil supply shock is worse now. It does look like Saudi Arabia pushing through the pipelines to Yanbu was a way to mitigate that. We're seeing even the UAE and the Port of Fujairah trying to bypass the Strait of Hormuz to try to do that, right? So you're seeing the countries adapt. But even the Iranians' ability to kind of export oil in China and India and other countries to purchase it, like that was really only and there weren't large quantities compared to where they were even before with their shadow fleets,
I mean,
right?
maybe they could end this whole conflict by announcing that they'll accept payments in Trump's stablecoin.
Well, they did say they were willing to take stable coins, specifically in crypto. And that could be, we kind of laugh, but that's something that the Iranians are trying to do. What I would say is, though, the we got a significant amount of reporting from inside of Iran of bank failures, inability for even members of the IRGC and the besieged to receive pay. And we know the president specifically was begging the IRGC to accept a ceasefire because he was concerned that if this war continued for a couple of weeks, that they would suffer a total economic collapse. And I think the economic problems that Iran has right now is so significant that it really limits their ability and this idea that they can take more shock or that they can tolerate this more than the United States or the Gulf. It's just an absurd statement because any money they made right now in any oil sales is pennies of what they need and will not be enough to reconstitute economic reconstruction inside of Iran, to reestablish their manufacturing base that has been targeted by Israel specifically under the premise and argument that these were dual use programs. And they really hampered large segments of Iranians' GDP and manufacturing base are gone. And I think that's just the reality, and that the Iranians are in a situation where, from the US perspective, now this blockade says, now you're not going to make money doing anything. And we could just sit back. And I think from the Trump administration perspective, say, we know you guys are going to suffer more than we are. Although the American consumer might see more price of from in the gas pumps, American oil companies and our oil industry and our LNG industry is skyrocketing. We have become, in many ways, the replacement, at least for a lot of the international commodities, from the GCC right now. And that's why the price of the Western Testing Index is going up, which rises the price of gas because everybody wants to buy American oil, but that's more money for American corporations. And so that's where the administration is, I think, is taking a step back and saying, I can assure you, Iran, we can tolerate this more. You do not want to negotiate under our terms. We're blocking your oil. Let's see how you can respond.
And from a strategic military perspective, that might make sense. But because of the American political system, I think there's a high level of exposure. And we've already been warned that the longer the strait remains closed, the larger the energy shock, the more ripple effects this will have, and the longer it will take to recover from that. And so the calculus for Iran isn't just military. It's wondering and watching what's happening in the United States domestically and politically. And the more unpopular this becomes, the more pressure there is going to be to find some sort of ceasefire, or at least more progress in negotiations.
Well, and I think one of the other areas that we need to keep an eye on outside of just this, but it's kind of obviously tied to it, and Iran wants to tie this, is the situation in Lebanon, right? I mean, part of it, when the ceasefire was originally announced, Iran said it did incorporate Lebanon. And Israel said no. President Trump said no. Although it looks like President Trump, at least in the beginning, was trying to limit Israel's operations instead of Beirut and Hezbollah. Obviously, the war there is continuing. It does look like, at least in Iraq, that situation has ended, right? U.S. strikes in Iraq are finished. That has not continued. But Lebanon and Israel operations in Lebanon are nonstop. And one of the key towns that I'm looking at in southern Lebanon is Ben Jabil in southern Lebanon. This is a key Hezbollah stronghold that actually, in many aspects, like even from not only from a military and militant component for Hezbollah and a base of operation, is significant, but it kind of had a lot of kind of like from a propaganda perspective, a lot of influence because of 2006 when Israel invaded in 2006. They had a hard time seizing the city because Israel had to rush into Lebanon because of the rockets, because back then they didn't have Iron Dome, and that kind of allowed Hezbollah to be much more successful in doing hit and run tactics and insurgency tactics against Israel. Now that town is completely surrounded, and Israel is slowly picking off Hezbollah fighters in the town, and it's a matter of question of when the town completely falls into the IDF hands, showing that regardless of what Iran, that they want the ceasefire to extend into Lebanon, and they've said that they've really done nothing to challenge that. And Israel is operating in southern Lebanon with a lot of impunity, and the casualties that we're seeing, even Hezbollah associated media claim compared to the IDF. I mean, it's astronomical. We're talking about hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of fighters. I think since this war started, last week, Reuters reported from Hezbollah sources that 400 Hezbollah fighters were killed. Israel, I think, is claiming anywhere from 1,000 to 1,500. And the truth is actually probably closer to Israel's assessment right now, specifically because the Battle of Ben Jabil is being a huge strain on Hezbollah forces. And I mean, I'm not saying that Israel can kill their way to success, but right now they're operating with a lot of initiative, and Hezbollah is having a hard time halting Israel's attacks.
Well, I think that's an interesting point, especially when you tie it back to the 2006 Israel-Hezbollah war, because it became a symbolic and strategic stronghold for Hezbollah. But it sounds like now, based on your analysis, that it's still symbolic, but not as strategic. And when it falls, the same symbolism that it held could make that a significant defeat for Hezbollah, I would think.
I mean, it's not going to be a strategic defeat. I mean, I mean, they're going to lose the town, right? And so that's going to be significant. I mean, both from a tactical level loss for Hezbollah. No, that is true. At a tactical level, it's a huge loss, and from a propaganda and information warfare perspective, it's a significant one. Now, is it like the deathbed of Hezbollah? Of course not, right? But I think the problem that this is showing is that, right, unlike I think people, when we're analyzing why is Israel now is operating much more slowly with a lot more freedom of maneuver compared to 2006, it's because Iron Dome changed everything. I mean, the invention of Iron Dome and the wide distribution and utilization of Iron Dome fundamentally shifted the strategic balance in Israel's favor compared to the proxy network, specifically Hamas and Hezbollah. That's why, like, in the beginning, when Hamas launched October 7th, there was a huge rocket volley that actually really didn't succeed. Where Hamas was very successful was in the ground operation, and Israel was able to rapidly mobilize and kind of obviously now make Hamas, from at least a threat to Israel component, like an actual military force capable of challenging Israel, almost non-existent in that aspect. They're still able to do hit and runs and have operations inside of Gaza, which, by the way, is still continuing. I mean, Israel regularly announces they have conduct strikes against Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad fighters inside of Gaza. We still see them do the same in the West Bank as well. And obviously, one of the interesting aspects of Gaza, when we're talking about it, is the rise of these anti-Hamas militias that Israel is supporting. But if you look at that now, the reason why we didn't see that in 2006, where also Hamas was involved back then in 2006 against Israel, is because Israel had to overutilize their ground forces to try to destroy a lot of these rockets because they didn't have Iron Dome, and Israel as a whole was beholden to these rockets. With Iron Dome, I mean, again, the main threat and the main deterrence that these groups had vanished overnight. Vanished overnight. And so that's why we've seen Israel in a much more methodical way dismantle Hamas's base of operations in Gaza. And that's why we're seeing them do it in Hezbollah, and it's much slower and deliberate fashion. For example, this last town I sent Benjamin, like the way they're doing is that they're surrounding the town. And then they have some elements kind of go in and come out, but they've been very methodical. And again, it goes back to is because they're not concerned about the rockets being launched. So they're unlike in 2006, where they had to try to push their ground forces extensively to push Hezbollah as far back as possible to prevent those rockets from reaching Israel. With the Iron Dome, that's now the whole military plan completely changed, and they still had the objective of clearing Hezbollah south of the Litani River. I think that's Israel's overall strategic goal. But because Hezbollah can't do anything about it, now it's just these ground combat operations that, with Israel having air superiority over Lebanon, they have the advantage. And I honestly think that we're going to run into a situation just as Israel was able to do in Gaza and really cause issues and pain for Hamas and basically make them from a military threat against Israel as a country insignificant, right? Hamas doesn't play that role anymore. That's the goal I think that they're going to try to do with Hezbollah. It's important to note that it does look like the Israelis and Lebanese, specifically at least the ambassadors, both of those countries' ambassadors in the United States, are going to be involved with negotiations. I believe it's going to be hosted by Secretary of State Marco Rubio to try to see if the government of Lebanon, the government of Israel, and the United States government can get into agreement to kind of disarm and remove Hezbollah as a military force. But what you're seeing from a military component is just as Israel has established the yellow line in Gaza, and Hamas has a very small area of territory they control in the Gaza Strip. I think now what you're going to see in Lebanon is that similar construct against Hezbollah, but just south of the Litani River. And then just as in Gaza, Israel continues to conduct strikes and some limited operations against Hamas in Gaza, they're probably going to do the similar aspect against Hezbollah north of the Litani River, as happened earlier this week, or at the end of last week, I'm sorry, after the ceasefire with Iran was announced. There was a major bombing campaign led by Israel against Hezbollah in Beirut that reportedly killed maybe up to 100, if not 200 Hezbollah fighters. And I think that's going to be the new normal for Lebanon unless Israel, Lebanon, and the United States enter an agreement. But I think the minimal thing that Israel will accept is the complete disarmament and if not disbandment of Hezbollah, which will
I
fundamentally
think
weaken Iran.
Israel's certainly using the Iran crisis as a window to degrade Hezbollah and in their command. I do worry about these tactics creating larger occupation and insurgency problems for Israel long term, and they will no longer have. If we see new groups develop, they will no longer have the same levers that they used to with Iran. The one thing, so you had mentioned that they had been having talks or that they were going to have talks. I believe you're right. I think those were going to be held in Washington. But it's also important to note that Hezbollah has already rejected the process. And with the Lebanese government being so weak, which is one of the reasons Israel is using this opportunity, I can't imagine creating a ceasefire framework that is going to lead to state control in Lebanon.
I mean, I think, yeah, that's the thing. How does the Lebanese government challenge Hezbollah? That's going to be the main problem set. But I wouldn't completely discount this possibility. And I think, with even Iran, like that is kind of the long-term goal and objective, right? So time will tell if that's kind of what we see happen. And I really do think that Israel is going to operate militarily with a lot of impunity, and there's really not much that Hezbollah can really do to challenge that. And clearly, President Trump's threat against Iran and now doing this blockade against Iran is enabling Benjamin Netanyahu to operate with impunity against Hezbollah, which has always been a desire and objective of Israel, because let's not forget that there is supposed to be a ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah ever since, in 2024, and Israel continued to conduct strikes against Hezbollah with absolute impunity. Now you just have the situation of ground operation. But Matt, but to finish this, obviously we just talked about the Straits of Hormuz, we talked about Iran, the GCC countries, Israel, Lebanon, even Gaza, briefly even Iraq. I think one of the areas that I like to talk about to end this episode of Global Intel is the situation in the elections in Hungary. Viktor Orban, the prime minister for the last 16 years in Hungary, lost that election in a landslide. The opposition now has a supermajority to the point where they can rewrite the constitution. And obviously, there's a lot of domestic aspects of this. And obviously, the opposition in Hungary is about to take power. Peter Magre, he's been very much, at least vocally, pro-European, saying we need to get back and fix our relationship with the EU, fix our relationship with NATO, be a reliable partner. Obviously, maybe the situation with Ukraine is not going to be fixed overnight, but in a much more positive development. But clearly, this is a loss for Vladimir Putin. I mean, a lot of the reporting that we were getting is, I think, Viktor Orban, his government was almost like a mole of the Russians for EU policies as a whole, specifically the foreign minister, was just passing sensitive conversations that the EU was having directly to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Russia, to Sergei Lavrov. And so this loss of this election is a significant loss for Vladimir Putin inside of Russia. I mean, yes, he can still have, Fico in Slovakia and maybe some in the Czech Republic, but nobody was, let's say, clearly an asset to the Russian government as Viktor Orban, and now he's lost that. I think that's a watershed moment for the European Union, and it's going to give them a breath of fresh air, not only internally as a group, as a bloc, but also against Vladimir Putin. But Matt, I would love your take.
Yeah, I mean it's a earthquake in their political system for sure. And Magyar's party is center right, so it's still an opposition, and it coalesced around this center right party. And I think a lot of that pro EU message of the TISA party really came through and helped lead them to this victory. We saw record turnout, something like 80%, and right now the reporting I've seen is about two-thirds majority has been won by the TISA party, which is Magyar's party. And now we just need to see what comes next. The point you made about uh, not just like the intelligence sharing, but their actions in Brussels, specifically with the veto power. So I think that we're most likely going to see a more predictable presence from Hungary in Brussels, and that will be a good thing. We also have to see if potentially, we've heard it talked about, whether or not the EU gets rid of that veto power to make it easier for them to pass uh, things through their parliament. The other aspect that we should also be looking out for is the speed at which they pursue the anti-corruption and judicial reforms, and whether or not they're slow walked by potentially some of those within the institutions that are still pro-Orban, because you have to imagine that those exist. And that might be something that they have to tackle before we see a lot of the reforms that have been spoken about.
And I guess, I mean, with the European Union kind of maybe in a moment of crisis because of the relationship with the United States and kind of vis-a-vis this role with NATO, um, can this change of government in Hungary empower the EU as a bloc? Or do you still think that the key factor within the European Union is still the individual countries that are members of it, like France and Germany, trying to take a leadership role in geopolitics and roles in international affairs? Or with this new government in Hungary, you might see the EU now become the primary voice for all of Europe in the international stage. And it's interesting to note that Pedro Sanchez, the Prime Minister of Spain, recently announced that he wants a European army now, a combined European army now, not in 5 years, not in 10 years. He literally said that in his speech, but immediately. Obviously, not saying that the Hungary government, even with this new one, is going to be completely 100% pro European, but could it transform the EU and maybe give it that breath of fresh air and that backing it sorely needs to not only confront Russia, but maybe even President Trump.
I mean, I think that we will see it more unified we certainly will see this. I'm comfortable saying that. We will certainly see the EU as a more unified bloc. The main obstacle and roadblock that the EU has had, especially in support of Ukraine, but we will start to hopefully see more of those aid packages going through, and I think there will be a momentum to that and a cohesiveness uh, that is felt throughout the bloc. And if they do manage to get rid of that veto power, it could be a double-edged sword. It could, on the one hand, allow them to react more quickly and hopefully cut some of the red tape if they make some internal reforms as well, but it will allow them to move more quickly and more agile. And then on the other hand, you also have the potential, if the veto is overturned, to start seeing other states become frustrated with the EU if they feel like they're constantly not being heard. So, like I said, it could be a double-edged sword, but I do think in the near term, 100% you are going to see a more unified EU, and that is going to lead to sort of like run-on effects, even in spaces outside of the atmosphere in Ukraine and the support for Ukraine.
My last question to you, because I know Viktor Orban, at least years ago, or even recently, was very interested in sending members of the Hungarian special forces over to the Sahel to fight Jenim and Al Qaeda and ISIS in the greater Sahel. Would love your take. Have you heard any updates on Hungary's military presence in the Sahel? Do you think that the new government is going to continue that approach or reshift it? Would love your take from the Hungary piece related to the Sahel, because that was something Viktor Orban was very keen on doing.
He might have been keen on doing it, but they were never a major presence. I I don't think we're going to see them looking in that direction anytime soon. I think a lot of lessons were learned after the end of Operation Barkhane was that the French were able to sustain operations down in the Sahel. And when the French pulled out, they had to cancel uh, the UN mission in Mali. Even though the Germans tried to support it the best they could not do it without the French, who were doing that on the side while they were conducting Operation Barkhane. So the mechanisms aren't really there, the support structure isn't really there, and with a lot of the leadership changes that we saw in that series of coups, they're not going to be going into Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso. And so their options would be limited. What they could do is join in some of the programs that are ongoing in places like Benin, where the EU has a presence, or in Nigeria. Some of that is through police training programs or maritime support. That's where you might see them involved. But no, I don't think Hungary is going to become a player down there, at least not one that is recognized outside or independent of the EU missions.
Well, thank you, Matt. I think the elections in Hungary were in a cycle of crazy news that we've seen in 2026. That was obviously a major news development. Obviously, we saw President Trump put a lot of political capital in JD Vance going to Hungary to campaign with Viktor Orban, and just wasn't enough. And they suffered a major defeat in Hungary. So obviously, a new Europe and a new Hungary awaits. We've already seen the EU leadership take victory laps already with the news of this new government coming into place. But obviously, the situation in Iran and the Middle East continues to deteriorate. So um, that is probably going to be the immediate focus for any European countries. But I do want to end on this note, Matt, before we wrap in the last segment of the Global Intel, quickly about Russia, Ukraine. I think it's important to note that I believe it was last month in March 2026 was the first time in years that the territorial control inside of Ukraine shifted in favor of Ukraine instead of Russia. In other words, that Ukraine was able to seize more territory than lose and remove some of that territorial aspect from the Russians. So the Russian map and the control, if you look at it on a map, shrunk just so slightly, just a little bit, but that's a significant development. And you've seen Ukraine and President Zelensky's has now put a new focus, an objective on causing casualties on the Russians, significantly more so, where they're looking at monthly casualty rates at 50,000 per month. That's the goal they want. Obviously, the objective, I think, is to cause more casualties for the Russians and they're able to replace them from recruitment, or they're starting to force the pull, which you might consider Russian military assets inside of Russia. That might be, kind of what's remaining or left of the strategic reserve. When we saw the Russian military balloon and grow significantly, obviously we saw a more major focus and push of Russian military assets into other areas, closer to the Baltics, to the Nordic countries, etc. Now you're starting to see the goal is to force the Russians to pull those forces over into Ukraine and not leverage for something else. And I think that's a new big, a worrying development if you're looking at this from the Russian side, or a very successful development if you're looking at this from Ukraine. That again, last month was the first time in years that Ukraine was able to seize more territory than they lost, and that we're seeing the casualty rate significantly increase for the Russians and really put a strain where they're suffering more casualties than their ability to recruit replacements and get new bodies. And I think that's something that is key to look at. I remember when I was looking at Russia Ukraine, and I was having this conversation all the way back in 2024. It was with I was having a conversation with a lot of OSINTers, and I think the consensus we all got was the critical year for Russia was 2026. In other words, that 2026 could be the beginning of the breaking point for the Russians. Not that a collapse is imminent, not that we should expect the Russian military to fold under pressure, or that the Ukrainians would be able to do another summer or spring offensive successfully. That was not the argument, but that the ability of Russia to be a somewhat effective force would be spent by 2026. And now the problem was going to be compounded that it doesn't matter how many bodies you throw at the problem set, you will not be able to seize more territory. And again, maybe we're not there yet, but we're seeing that early signs of a significant degradation of the Russian military. That I think the war in Iran has fundamentally shifted the focus on Russia Ukraine, but there's been very positive developments for Ukraine in the last couple of months, in the last couple of weeks. That might be the beginning of signs showing a deterioration of Russia's military position. And the last thing I'll say, Matt, before I pass it on to you is I think President Zelensky was a huge winner in this war between Iran and the Middle East, and his ability to send military forces to the GCC countries to shoot down these Iranian drones got him a lot of not only goodwill, but even military and economic support from the GCC countries, who now look at Russia as the primary geopolitical supporter of Iran. And now these GCC countries look at Ukraine as the country that sent military personnel and equipment to bring down these Iranian drones that in some cases were armed and provided intelligence by the Russians as an enemy. So I think Zelensky has had a good last couple of weeks between the military component inside of Ukraine as well as the diplomatic and geopolitical situation in the Middle East.
One thing that I would add to the commentary with the Russian-Ukraine war is we also did see the complete collapse of the Easter ceasefire, and I think that shows us just how little space there is for a truce at this time. That doesn't mean things are going to change, but it's pretty clear that in terms of positioning and messaging and blaming assignment on this, it's going both ways. But I think they were both trying to take advantage of that ceasefire. So hopefully, when we see this in the future, uh, maybe there is a foundation for a little bit more monitoring of the situation and hopefully a little de-escalation. And that would give you potentially an indication that there is growing space for a truce or a ceasefire. But with that, I mean, we've covered a lot of topics tonight. I think two of them were not like the others, but thanks as always for joining us, Stefano. This has been the bottom line up front, and this was a global intel roundup.